The wind blew softly across the small village as evening light painted everything golden. Children ran barefoot on the dusty road, their laughter echoing between the old brick houses. Women gathered near the well, talking about the day's chores and the soldiers who had passed through weeks ago. Life in the village always moved slow, but for one young woman named Amina, every minute felt heavy, like time itself was waiting for someone who hadn't returned. Amina sat by the broken wooden fence of her small house, her hands resting on her lap. She looked toward the road again and again, the same way she had every day since he left. Her heart carried a memory that refused to fade, the promise he made before leaving. "I'll come back," he had said, smiling under his dusty helmet. "You'll see me again." That was 2 years ago. His name was Arif, a young soldier who had grown up in the same village. He had always been quiet but kind, the sort of person who noticed when someone needed help. Before the war, he worked in the nearby fields, often carrying sacks of grain heavier than himself just to help the older farmers. People liked him for his steady hands and calm heart. Amina had known him since childhood. She used to laugh at how serious he was, even when they were kids. But somewhere between their laughter and growing years, something gentle had grown between them, something unspoken but strong. When the army came recruiting, Arif had been one of the first to step forward. "It's our duty," he said quietly when his father protested. "Someone has to protect home." Amina didn't say anything then, but she remembered how her hands shook when she tied the small prayer cloth around his wrist before he left. "You promised," she whispered to him that night. "You promised you'd come back." He smiled, touched her hand gently, and said the words she still carried like a heartbeat. "I'll come back, Amina, no matter what happens." The first few months after his departure were filled with letters, short ones, written in careful handwriting that showed how tired he was but still hopeful. He wrote about the camp, the rain, the smell of gun oil, and how sometimes he could still hear her laughter in his dreams. Amina read those letters again and again until the ink began to fade. But then, after the third month, the letters stopped coming. She waited by the post road every morning, asking the messenger if there was anything for her. Each time he only shook his head. People told her to move on, to forget. They said soldiers rarely returned from where he had gone, but she refused to believe it. Somewhere inside her heart she was certain Arif was still alive. Seasons changed. The war dragged on. News came from nearby towns, some destroyed, some rebuilt, but still no word of Arif. Then one afternoon a group of soldiers arrived in the village. Their uniforms were torn, their faces tired, carrying the dust of battle. People gathered around, asking about their sons and brothers. Amina stood at the back, her heart pounding. When the officer read out the list of names, those who had fallen, Amina's knees went weak. She listened for Arif's name, her hands trembling, but it never came. Relief washed over her like rain after a drought. "He's alive," she whispered to herself. He must be alive, but weeks passed again with no news. Her hope began to fight against silence. Every sunset looked the same, yet heavier. The road that once brought soldiers back now looked empty and endless. Amina spent her days helping in the field and her nights sitting under the old tree near her home, staring at the stars she once watched with him. Then, one morning, as the first light touched the earth, a sound broke the silence. It was distant at first, a slow crunch of boots on gravel. The villagers turned toward the road, curious. A single figure appeared from the haze of dust, walking with a slight limp, his uniform faded and torn. His rifle hung loosely from his shoulder. Amina's heart stopped for a second. She stood, her breath caught in her throat. As the man came closer, the village began to whisper. His face was thinner, older, marked with exhaustion and pain, but it was him. It was Arif. Amina ran forward without thinking. Her scarf flew behind her as tears filled her eyes. Arif saw her and stopped walking. His eyes, once bright with youth, now carried 1,000 stories of war. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. "You promised you'd come back," Amina said in a trembling voice, the words breaking like waves. Arif's rifle slipped from his shoulder and fell into the dust with a dull thud. His knees shook as he looked at her. He tried to smile, but his face quivered. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I told you I would." Amina reached out, touching his arm gently, afraid he might disappear if she blinked. But he didn't. He stood there, breathing, alive. Then she saw the bandage on his leg, the faint scars on his hands, the exhaustion written across his face. He had returned, but he had left pieces of himself behind on battlefields she could never imagine. He told her little that day, only that many didn't make it back. He spoke of friends lost and places destroyed. When she asked why he didn't write, he looked down. "There were times," he said slowly, "when I didn't know if I'd see another sunrise. I didn't want to give you false hope." Amina didn't answer. She just held his hand. His fingers were rough and cold but familiar. As the village gathered around, people cheered and cried. Mothers hugged their sons tighter. Fathers whispered prayers of thanks. But Amina and Arif stood apart, lost in their own small world. Later that night, under the same stars that had watched them as children, they sat together in silence. He told her how he used to whisper her name in the dark trenches, how it gave him strength when everything else seemed lost. She listened, tears rolling down her cheeks, realizing how close she had come to losing him forever. When the moon rose high, Arif looked at her and said softly, "It wasn't the orders or the medals that brought me back. It was your promise. It kept me alive." Amina smiled through her tears and said, "Then I'll never let you go again." He looked away, his eyes wet. "War doesn't end in one day," he said quietly. "But being home, it feels like the first piece of peace I've had in years." The night air was cool. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and the world felt almost normal again. Arif leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet. Amina watched him, knowing that he was home but not fully healed. Still, she was grateful. He had kept his word, and in that small, forgotten village under the stars, two hearts found their way back to each other after years of waiting. The promise that once felt like a fragile hope had finally been fulfilled, though at a heavy cost. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly across the quiet village. Birds sang from the trees and the smell of warm bread drifted through the air. For most people, it was an ordinary day, but for Amina, it was the first morning in years when she woke up without fear. Arif was home. She had dreamed of that moment for so long that it still felt unreal. When she opened her eyes, she half expected to find it all gone, but then she saw him sitting outside, his bandaged legs stretched out, staring at the horizon. He sat in silence, watching the road as if it still held ghosts. His hands rested on his knees, his face calm but distant. There was something heavy in his eyes, something Amina couldn't name. She stepped outside quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. "You didn't sleep?" she asked softly. Arif smiled faintly. "I'm still learning how to sleep again," he said. In the camps there was always noise, engines, boots, shouting. Here it's too quiet. Amina sat beside him. The sun touched his scarred face and she noticed the way he flinched when a rooster crowed in the distance. Small sounds made him alert, his body reacting before his mind could calm down. She didn't say anything, but she understood. The war had followed him home in ways that no one could see. Days passed and people from the village came to visit him. They wanted to hear stories of the war, to ask if their sons or brothers were seen in the battles. Arif answered what he could, but sometimes he just lowered his gaze and said nothing. The truth was harder than they imagined. The faces of those lost haunted him. Every night he saw flashes of explosions, the cries of his comrades, the sight of someone he couldn't save. At night, Amina would hear him whisper in his sleep, calling out names, apologizing to voices only he could hear. Sometimes he woke up sweating, his chest rising fast. She would light a small lamp and sit beside him until his breathing slowed again. He never told her what the dreams were about, but she could guess. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the fields shimmered with fading light, Arif went to visit his old home. His father was waiting for him near the door. The old man's eyes filled with tears when he saw his son standing there. They didn't speak much, there were no words big enough for that kind of moment. His father placed a trembling hand on Arif's shoulder and said, "You came back, my son. That's enough." Inside the house, everything was just as Arif remembered. The small window, the worn-out mat, the tools hanging on the wall. It felt like time had stopped there. But Arif knew time hadn't stopped. It had simply passed without him. He had missed weddings, harvests, and funerals. Some of his childhood friends were gone. The world had changed quietly while he was away. He stayed with his family that night, talking little but feeling the weight of being home. The next morning he walked to the edge of the fields where he used to work before the war. The soil was dry, but the air smelled of promise. Farmers waved at him, inviting him to join, but his legs still hurt and he couldn't move the way he once did. He smiled and said, "Maybe soon." When he returned to Amina's house, she was waiting with food. "You walked too far," she said, worried. "You're not healed yet." "I needed to see the fields," he said quietly. "It reminds me who I was before everything." That evening, as they sat together, Arif began to talk more. He told her small things about his days in the army, how they shared one piece of bread among 3 people, how they slept under broken trucks, how sometimes they sang just to forget fear. But he never spoke about the battles themselves. Amina didn't ask. She could see that some memories were too sharp to touch. The village elders came one day and told Arif that the government would soon be giving medals to returning soldiers. "You should go," one of them said proudly. "You deserve honor for your service." Arif shook his head. "Honor belongs to those who didn't return," he said quietly. "I just came back alive. That's all." Amina looked at him then and realized something deep. The man who had left with dreams of courage and glory had come back with something heavier, wisdom and sorrow. But even with all the scars, there was still kindness in his heart. Weeks went by, and slowly Arif began to heal. He started helping again in the village, repairing fences, guiding young boys on how to work the land, teaching them discipline and patience. People respected him not just for being a soldier, but for the calm strength he carried. Children followed him around, calling him hero. He would laugh softly and say, "Real heroes are the ones who stayed behind and kept life going." One day, Amina found him sitting near the old tree by the river, carving something into a piece of wood. She walked closer and saw that it was a small wooden bird. "You still make these?" she asked with a smile. He nodded. "I made them in the camp too. When we had nothing, I used to carve these birds and give them to others. It reminded us that one day we would be free to fly again." She sat beside him and watched as he worked, the sound of the knife scraping against the wood gentle and steady. "You never lost your heart," she whispered. Arif looked at her, his eyes soft. "It was you who kept it alive," he said. "Every time I thought I couldn't make it, I remembered your words." Amina's cheeks warmed. "I only said you promised to come back." "And I did," he said with a faint smile. "But I think I left a part of myself behind." She reached for his hand. "Then we'll find it again, here, together." That night, as they sat under the stars again, the world seemed peaceful for once. But the peace didn't erase the past, it simply rested on top of it like soft dust over scars. Arif began to write again. His handwriting was slow and uneven, but it was honest. He wrote about his friends, about the things he learned, about how small kindness could save a man's soul in the darkest moments. He said he wanted to leave these stories behind so no one would forget what real courage meant. The villagers often came to him for advice. Some young men wanted to join the army like he once did. Arif would listen carefully, then say, "War is not what you see in songs or stories. It's not glory, it's loss. If you truly want to serve your people, do it by keeping peace, not by chasing war." His words stayed with many of them. As the days passed, Amina noticed he smiled more often. The deep lines on his face softened. He began to laugh again, sometimes at small things. A child's joke, a chicken running after corn, a goat stuck in a fence. Life, in its simple way, was teaching him how to breathe again. Still, there were quiet moments when he'd go silent, his eyes far away, lost in thoughts she couldn't follow. When that happened, she would touch his shoulder gently, and he would come back as if remembering where he was. One evening, rain began to fall, the first rain since his return. The scent of wet earth filled the air. Amina stood in the doorway watching the droplets dance on the ground. Arif stepped out and lifted his face to the sky. The water ran down his scars, washing away dust and old pain. He smiled, and for the first time in a long while it looked real. Amina joined him, and together they stood in the rain, not speaking, just feeling the moment. It was as if the world itself was healing with them. When the rain stopped, the air was cool and clean. Arif looked at her and said, "I think I'm finally home." And in that quiet space between the sound of rain and the beating of their hearts, Amina knew that his words. Days turned into weeks, and the village slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. Fields filled with green shoots again, and the sound of life returned to the roads. But for Arif, every day was still a quiet battle between past and present. Some nights were calm, but others brought memories that clawed their way back into his dreams. He often woke before sunrise, sitting outside before anyone else was awake, just watching the world slowly light up. Amina began to understand his silence. She didn't ask questions when he stared at the horizon for too long, or when he walked to the edge of the village alone. She knew those walks were his way of finding peace. Sometimes she followed him quietly, keeping her distance just to make sure he wasn't lost in his thoughts too deeply. One morning, she found him near the small river where the water ran clear and slow. He was skipping stones across the surface the same way he had done as a boy. She smiled, remembering how he used to challenge her. How many skips could one stone make before sinking? But now his hand trembled slightly. The stone dropped before it reached the middle. "Your hand still hurts?" she asked softly, walking closer. He looked up at her with a faint smile. "Not my hand," he said. "Some things just take longer to heal." She sat beside him, the sound of the river filling the quiet. For a while neither spoke. The world around them felt calm, as if trying to protect that moment. Then Arif sighed and said, "Sometimes I wonder why I survived when others didn't." Amina looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. "Because you made a promise," she said. "And you kept it." He smiled sadly. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like carrying too many names in my heart." Amina placed her hand over his. "Then we'll remember them together," she said. From that day, Arif began carving again. Small wooden figures, birds, and faces. Each one, he said, was for someone he had known. He placed them near the tree outside Amina's house. The villagers began to notice, and soon, people started bringing flowers to the spot. It became a quiet place of remembrance, where even children came to leave wildflowers and prayers. As time passed, Arif's limp grew lighter. He started helping again in the fields, though Amina still worried when he worked too hard. Sometimes he would return home covered in dust and sweat, but his eyes looked clearer than before. One evening, as he washed his hands at the well, Amina noticed something she hadn't seen in a long time. His smile reached his eyes. "You look happy today," she said. He nodded. "For the first time in years, I felt tired from work, not from memory." Life began to bloom again between them. They shared small meals, laughed at small things, and sometimes just sat in silence without the weight of unspoken words. The villagers saw them together and smiled quietly. Some whispered that fate had written their story long before the war ever began. One afternoon, while Arif was helping repair a barn near the main road, a truck arrived carrying men in clean uniforms. They brought official papers and spoke with the village chief. Soon word spread that the army wanted to honor the soldiers who had returned alive. They wanted Arif to attend the ceremony in the city. When Amina told him, he grew quiet. "I don't know if I can stand there and be called a hero," he said. "You're not doing it for medals," she replied gently. "You're doing it for the ones who didn't come back." He thought about it for a long while before nodding. "Maybe you're right. Maybe they should be remembered properly." A few days later, dressed in his old uniform, Arif boarded the truck with 2 other men from the nearby villages. The villagers waved as they left, cheering for them. Amina stood near the road, her heart heavy but proud. Before he left, Arif looked at her and said softly, "I'll be back by sunset." The journey was long and the road was rough. When they reached the city, Arif felt a strange weight pressing on him. There were crowds, flags, and music, but he felt out of place among all the bright decorations. The officials spoke of bravery, honor, and sacrifice, but in his mind he saw faces of young men who had never come home. When his name was called, he stepped forward. The officer placed a medal around his neck and shook his hand. People clapped, but he felt no pride, only silence inside. Later, as he walked through the streets, he saw a small boy selling flowers by the roadside. The boy's face reminded him of a friend he had lost, and without thinking, Arif bought all the flowers the child had. He carried them to the nearest graveyard and laid them down at the base of an old monument. "For all of you," he whispered, closing his eyes for a moment. When he returned to the village that evening, Amina was waiting for him near the gate. "You came back," she said softly, smiling. "I promised I would," he said, handing her one of the small medals. "I don't need this." "You keep it," she frowned. "But it's yours." He shook his head. "It belongs to every person who prayed for me to come home. And it belongs to you. You kept my promise alive." Amina didn't argue. She just held the medal close to her heart. That night, they sat by the fire again. The moon hung low, painting the earth silver. Arif looked at the small wooden figures lined up near the tree, each one catching the moonlight. "They'll fade one day," he said quietly. "Wood fades," Amina said, "but memories don't." He looked at her and smiled. "That's why I came back. To remember, not to forget." The next morning, the village children gathered around him as he worked on another carving. One boy asked, "Uncle, were you scared in the war?" Arif smiled gently. "Yes, everyone was scared. But being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you keep moving even when you are." The boy nodded seriously, and Arif handed him the carving. "Keep it," he said. "It's for those who want to build, not destroy." Amina watched the exchange from a distance, her heart full. She knew that though the war had taken much from him, it had also given him something rare, a heart that understood the true value of peace. As the sun set that day, painting the fields gold once more, Arif stood by the same fence where he had once promised to return. Amina joined him, standing quietly beside him. "You kept your promise twice," she said softly, "once to return and once to live again." He looked at her and replied, "I couldn't have done either without you." The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the sound of laughter from children playing nearby. The world had changed, but somehow it had found its way back to life. That night, before going to sleep, Arif placed his hand on the wooden bird beside his bed. "For all the broken wings," he murmured, "may we all learn to fly again." And in that small home, filled with the soft sound of breathing and peace, the promise that had once seemed fragile now lived strong. Proof. The next few months brought a quiet kind of peace to the village. The war had ended far away, and slowly, letters and officials stopped coming. For many, it was time to rebuild the fields, repair the roofs, and plant seeds again. But for Arif, rebuilding wasn't just about fixing houses or fences. It was about rebuilding himself, piece by piece, day by day. He started waking up earlier than before. The first light of dawn always found him already outside, helping old farmers carry their tools or children herd goats along the narrow paths. Though his legs still ached sometimes, he never complained. People began to see him as a symbol of strength, not because he had fought a war, but because he had learned how to live after it. One morning, the schoolteacher from the nearby town came to visit. She had heard about the soldier who carved wooden figures and taught boys about discipline and peace. She asked him to visit the school once a week to speak to the children. Arif hesitated at first, unsure if he could stand in front of a classroom again. But Amina encouraged him. "You don't need to be a teacher," she said gently. "Just tell them what life has taught you." So he went. The first time he entered the small classroom, he felt strange. The smell of chalk and dust filled the air, and dozens of curious eyes stared at him. Some children were too young to understand war, but they listened with wide eyes as he spoke about courage, honesty, and kindness. He didn't talk about fighting or battles. He talked about helping your friend when they fall, about standing together when things go wrong, about believing in hope even when it feels small. His voice was calm, but each word carried weight. The children listened in silence, and when he finished, they clapped softly. One boy raised his hand and asked, "Did it hurt being away so long?" Arif smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "But coming back and learning how to smile again hurt more. It's a good kind of hurt. It means you're alive." From that day, he went to the school every week. The children began calling him Uncle Arif. They would wait for him by the gate, eager for his stories, not of war, but of hope and patience. He taught them how to carve little birds, just like the ones he made under the old tree. "Each bird," he said, "is a reminder that we can rise again no matter how hard the storm." Amina often came with him, helping with the lessons or bringing lunch for the children. She loved seeing how his eyes softened when he spoke to them, how his face looked alive again. For her, every moment was a quiet blessing. She had waited years for him to return, and now she watched him heal, not through medicine, but through kindness. One afternoon, while they were walking home from the school, Arif said quietly, "Do you think people can really forget the pain of the past?" Amina looked up at him. "No," she said, "but they can learn to carry it without falling." He nodded, thinking about her words. "You always know what to say," she smiled. "Because I spent years talking to your shadow when you were gone. I had to keep my heart strong somehow." They both laughed softly. and the sound felt like sunlight after a storm. As time passed, the government sent word that soldiers who had returned would receive small plots of land to rebuild their lives. When Arif's name came up, the village celebrated for him. He was given a piece of land near the river, a quiet green stretch where the water curved gently and the soil was rich. Amina went with him to see it for the first time. The air smelled of fresh grass and birds chirped in the nearby trees. "This could be our new beginning," she said softly. Arif looked at her with calm eyes. "Ours?" he repeated with a faint smile. She blushed and looked away. "You know what I mean." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "I want to build something here. Not just for me, but for others too. Maybe a small place where children can come to learn, where people can carve, plant, or just rest. A place of peace." Amina's eyes brightened. "Then we'll build it together." And so they began. Every day they carried wood, stones, and tools to the riverside. Villagers came to help, bringing whatever they could: nails, ropes, even food for the workers. The sound of hammers and laughter filled the air. Slowly, a small building began to rise, a simple structure with wide windows open to sunlight and wind. They called it the House of Peace. When it was finished, the villagers gathered to celebrate. Children ran around the open yard, and elders blessed the place with prayers. Arif stood quietly at the doorway, watching as people filled the space he had once only dreamed of. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Amina and Arif sat outside near the river. The stars shimmered above them, reflected in the dark water. "You did it," Amina said softly. "You turned your pain into something beautiful." He shook his head. "We did it," he said. "You were my reason to come back. This place is as much yours as mine." Amina smiled, but her eyes turned gentle. "You don't have to thank me. You came back because you had a strong heart." Arif looked at her for a long time before saying, "No, I came back because I had a promise to keep." A soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of the river. In that moment, everything felt still, as if the world itself paused to honor that simple truth. As months turned into a year, the House of Peace became more than a building. It became a living part of the village. Children learned there, farmers rested there, and sometimes travelers stopped by just to listen to Arif's calm words. People said he had a gift. His voice could quiet the heaviest hearts. One afternoon, a soldier in a new uniform arrived from the city. He brought an envelope with the government seal. Inside was a letter inviting Arif to speak at a memorial ceremony in the capital, honoring all soldiers who had served. Arif read the letter silently, his expression unreadable. Amina waited for him to speak. Finally, he said, "I'm not sure I want to go back to that world." "You won't be going back to war," she said gently. "You'll be going to remind people what peace really means." He folded the letter carefully. Maybe that's the only kind of battle left worth fighting. Before he left, Amina sewed a small cloth pouch and placed one of his carved birds inside it. "For luck," she said. He smiled and placed it over his heart. "For promises," he replied. When he returned from the ceremony days later, his eyes looked softer but stronger. He didn't bring medals or gifts, just new ideas. He wanted to expand the House of Peace into a school where children could learn both books and values: honesty, respect, and hope. Together, he and Amina began planning again, drawing simple lines in the dust to shape their dream. One evening, as the sun set and painted everything gold, Arif turned to her and said, "You waited for me when I was gone. You helped me rebuild my life. I don't want to walk ahead alone anymore." Amina's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she whispered. He looked into her eyes and said softly, "I mean I want to build the rest of my life with you." Her hands trembled, but she smiled. "Then make another promise," she said. He reached out and took her hand. "I promise I'll never leave again, not even in silence." And as the last light of day faded, they stood together by the river where everything had begun. The morning sun rose over the river, bathing the small village in soft light. Birds flew across the sky and their songs mixed with the distant laughter of children. Years had passed since Arif had returned home, and everything around him had changed, though his heart still remembered every moment that brought him here. The House of Peace stood strong near the water, its walls decorated with the wooden carvings he had made through the years. Every piece carried a story. A soldier remembered, a promise kept, a hope rebuilt. Arif walked slowly along the path that led to the building. His limp was softer now, but the rhythm of his steps told the story of a man who had lived through storms and learned to walk again. He opened the door and smiled at the sound inside. Children were already seated, their voices bright as they recited lessons. The small school he had dreamed of had become real. It wasn't grand, but it was alive. Amina stood near the board, helping a little girl write her name. Her hands moved gently, her voice calm and patient. When she saw Arif, her eyes lit up. "You're early today," she said with a smile. He laughed quietly. "The day feels longer when I stay away," he said. The children greeted him loudly. "Good morning, Uncle Arif," they shouted together. He nodded, pretending to be serious. "Good morning, young soldiers of peace," they giggled at his words. To them, he wasn't just a man who had once fought a war. He was the one who fixed their toys, told them stories of bravery, and taught them to be kind. As the class continued, Arif sat near the window, carving a small wooden heart for one of the children who had lost her father. His hands moved slowly but with purpose. Every line he carved was filled with care. When the girl came to him, he handed it to her with a smile. "Your father is in every heartbeat you take," he said softly. The girl hugged the carving and smiled through her tears. After class, Arif and Amina walked together through the village. The people greeted them warmly. Children ran beside them, carrying wooden birds and hearts he had given them over the years. It felt as if his pain had turned into something that helped others heal. As they reached the edge of the river, Arif sat down under the old tree where he and Amina had once waited for him to return. The tree was larger now, its branches stretching wide. "Do you remember?" he asked quietly. Amina smiled. "How could I forget? I sat here every day waiting to see you walking down that road again." He looked at the path, now covered in grass and sunlight. "I used to see this place in my dreams," he said. "Even when everything was falling apart, I saw this tree. I think it's what brought me home." They sat together for a long time, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Then Amina turned to him and said, "You've given this village so much, Arif, but have you ever given something to yourself?" He looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said softly, "you always build, help, and give. But you never rest. You never let yourself simply be," he smiled. "Maybe I don't know how to rest." "Then I'll teach you," she said, leaning gently against his shoulder. From that day, Amina began to make small plans for them both. Every Friday, they would close the House of Peace and spend the day walking by the river or visiting nearby farms. They helped plant trees, shared meals with neighbors, and laughed with children. The days were simple, but every one of them felt full. One afternoon, while they were sitting outside watching the sunset, Amina said quietly, "Do you ever regret joining the army?" Arif thought for a moment before answering. "No," he said slowly. "I don't regret it, but I regret how much of myself I lost to it. Still, maybe I had to lose something to understand what truly matters." She nodded. "And what matters now?" He looked at her with soft eyes. "You, this village, the peace we built." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "Then all your promises were worth keeping." The next few years were kind to them. The school grew bigger, and soon volunteers from nearby towns came to help. They built new rooms, planted gardens, and even started a small library. People from far away heard about the soldier who turned his pain into peace, and sometimes travelers came just to meet him. Arif always greeted them humbly, never speaking of himself as a hero. "I'm just a man who came home," he would say. Time, however, has its own way of reminding us of its passage. Arif's hair turned silver and his hands grew slower, but his eyes still shone with the same quiet strength. He often sat under the old tree, carving while children played nearby. Amina would bring him tea and they would sit together in the gentle evening light, content in silence. One evening, the sky filled with clouds, and rain began to fall softly. Amina stood by the doorway calling out, "Come inside, you'll catch a cold." Arif smiled and said, "Let me finish this one bird first. It's for the new boy who joined school today." She watched him carve carefully, his fingers steady despite his age. When he finished, he held the little bird up to the light and smiled. "There," he said softly, "another promise kept." That night, as they sat by the fire, Amina rested her head on his shoulder. "You've kept every promise you ever made," she whispered. He looked at her gently. "I made one more I still need to keep," he said. She smiled sleepily. "And what promise is that?" "To never let you feel alone again," he said quietly. Years later, when the villagers spoke about Arif, they always used the same words: kind, wise, brave. They built a small stone bench under the old tree in his memory, with words carved on it that he once said to the children, "Bravery is not about fighting wars. It's about keeping promises even when the world forgets." Amina kept the House of Peace running for many years. Every morning she opened the door and looked at the wooden carvings that lined the walls. Each one carried a part of him, a memory, a lesson, a story. She often told the children about the man who had promised to come back, and had kept that promise not just once, but every day through the way he lived. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she sat by the river, the same place where he had first promised to return. She closed her eyes and could almost hear his voice carried by the wind. "I'm here," it seemed to say. "I kept my word." She smiled softly, whispering to the air, "You always did." As the sun set and the stars appeared above the calm water, the village lights flickered one by one. The laughter of children echoed from the House of Peace, and the world felt gentle again. Arif's story had become part of the land, part of every life that touched that riverbank. Years turned into decades, but his promise never faded. Travelers still came from far places, sitting under the tree and reading the words on the bench. Some brought flowers, others brought wooden birds carved by their own hands, passing on the lesson he had left behind. In the end, Arif's story was not about war or loss. It was about return. It was about a man who came home not just to keep a promise to a woman, but to keep a promise to life itself. And in doing so, he taught everyone around him that real strength lies not in weapons or medals, but in the courage to love, to rebuild, and to believe again. And every time the wind passed through the village, it carried the soft sound of